Nier Automata has arrived on Nintendo Switch, and to be blunt, it looks pretty darn good. Earlier this year, we heard that Nier would target 1080p docked and 720p handheld, the maximum resolutions of the Nintendo Switch in either of those configurations. Of course, both of these resolutions would be dynamic, adjusting for rendering load on the fly. And when we hear targeting 1080p docked on Switch, we've come to expect that the actual resolution will almost never hit that. Target is a somewhat meaningless phrase most of the time. So that's why, with every frame I counted, I became more and more impressed. Not only does Nier Automata on Nintendo Switch target a full 1080p, it actually hits it. And from our testing of the opening hour or so, it hits it the vast majority of the time. This far into the Switch's life, image quality isn't something we usually see prioritized in third-party ports. Oftentimes, it's the first thing to go, in order to keep demanding effects like screen space reflections, motion blur, and of course a steady frame rate. So how is Nier Automata performing so well on Nintendo Switch? Well, in isolation without anything to compare it to, this version of Nier Automata looks pretty good on its own merits. But when we do pull in the PS4 version running here on the PS5 via backwards compatibility, we can start to spot the cuts. Firstly, and most obviously, the frame rate has been cut from 60 to 30. If resolution was going to stay high, it's no surprise that this had to give, but we'll come back to frame rate later. When it comes to high-end rendering features, the Switch somewhat lucks out with Nier, in that from a purely technical perspective, Nier's presentation is somewhat plain. You won't see a lot of complex volumetrics or screen space effects, which means there isn't too much dragging down the Switch version. Even the major cutscenes were already pre-rendered in other versions, but of course there are still visual cuts to be made. We do see a cut to texture resolution. You can spot it when you get a close-up of 2B herself, or on the arms of Buzzsaw Louie here. Characters and smaller enemies seem to hold up well at regular camera distance, but large enemies and certain elements of the environments can appear a bit blurry. Shadow quality is also of a lower resolution, as are some particle effects. Draw distances on shadows also appear to have been pulled back. Some scenes also show evidence of changes to lighting, though in some instances this may also be due to changes in the materials of those objects as well. Motion blur is also cut, which in combination with the drop to 30 frames per second means motion on a whole feels significantly less smooth as compared to other versions. But on the topic of frame rate, I will note that performance in that regard is fairly good. When testing these early areas of the game, we get a pretty constant 30 frames per second the whole way through, with hardly any drops. But because code for this game only came in a few days before launch, we haven't had time to extensively test the entire game. Matt Zawodniak, who will be handling the actual review, did note that he experienced some mild slowdown in later, more open areas of the game. We'll be able to dig into those later areas in his full review, but for now, frame rate appears to be solid, save for some slight chugging in those later areas. When put side by side with other versions, you can certainly spot the differences, but at the end of the day, our initial impressions of this port are that it is quite impressive. Rarely do we see resolutions and frame rate be such a clear high priority in third-party Switch releases. Presumably, the technological crossover between Nier Automata and other Platinum titles like Bayonetta and Astral Chain that are already on Switch helped to ease this porting process, but it is quite an achievement regardless. The port was handled by Virtuos, who have been responsible for quite a few impressive Switch ports, such as Dying Light, Starlink Battle for Atlas, Dark Souls Remastered, and the Spyro Reignited trilogy. Their work here appears to be some of their best yet. As I said, we'll have much more coverage of Nier Automata in Matt's full review coming very soon, but I hope you've enjoyed this initial look at the technical side of things. If you have any questions, feel free to give me a shout on Twitter using the handle on the screen, and subscribe to this channel to make sure you don't miss our review when it comes out. You can also check out NintendoWorldReport.com for a whole lot more, and if you'd like to chat with us about this or anything else, feel free to join our Discord. There is a link in the description. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more.
all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.